guys, so a polychord, as the name implies, is two or more chords superimposed on top of each other. So for example, a D major triad over a C major triad. It's written as two chords, one on top of the other, separated by a horizontal line, as you can see up here in the picture-in-picture. Now this notation is similar to that of a slash chord, so it's important that you don't confuse the two. A polychord is one chord played on top of another chord that is notated by a horizontal line, for example, a D major over a C major 7, while a slash chord is a chord played on top of a particular root note and is notated by a diagonal line, for example, a D minor 7 on G. Now I have a separate video on slash chords which you can go watch if you like. Now there are two ways of thinking about polychords. You can think about a polychord as a single entity or a single chord, or you can think about it as two separate entities or chords, and so creating a kind of polytonality. So firstly, if we think about a polychord as a single entity, then you simply look at all of the notes that comprise the polychord and infer the proper chord name. For example, a D major triad over a C major 7 chord is just a C major 13 sharp 11. A D minor 7 over a C minor 7 chord is just a C minor 13 chord. An A flat major 7 over a C7 is just a C7 sharp 9 flat 13 chord. And an A6 over a C7 is just a C13 flat 9 sharp 11 chord. Using this approach, polychords are just another way of naming a particular chord, which can be simpler to read. Right, when you're sight reading, sometimes it's easier to think about two small chords rather than one big one. So you may find it easier to think, I need to play an A6 in my right hand and a C7 in my left hand, rather than I need to play a C13 flat 9 sharp 11 chord. So using this approach, when improvising over a polychord, you simply play the scale implied by the actual full chord. So for example, over that D major triad over C major 7 chord, which is your C major 13 sharp 11, you would just use a C Lydian scale. And over that D minor 7 on C minor 7 polychord, you can just play C Dorian. Over the A flat major 7 on C7 polychord, you could play the C altered scale. And over that A6 on C7 polychord, you could play the C half whole diminished scale. Right, another way of saying this is that you want to pick a scale which contains all or almost all the notes of the polychord. So C Lydian mode contains all the notes of the polychord D over C major 7. So it fits well over that chord. And the C half whole diminished scale contains all the notes in that polychord A6 on C7. Now, the second way that you can think about polychords is as two separate entities which imply a polytonality. Using this approach, when improvising over a polychord, you can play a scale or a chord that fits over each one of those two individual chords. So again, taking this D major triad over C major 7 polychord, even though we're playing these two chords together, we can sort of separate them and think about them individually. So this polychord contains the D major triad, which means we can use scales and arpeggios which outline or imply this D major triad chord. So like D Ionian or D Lydian or just a D arpeggio. And taking this C major 7 by itself, we could play scales or an arpeggio which outlines or implies this individual, this part of the polychord, the C major 7. So again, you could play C Ionian, C Lydian, or just an arpeggio of the C major 7 chord. Right, and similarly, taking that A6 over A7 polychord, we could look at the A6 chord by itself and decide to play a Ionian or a Lydian or just an A6 arpeggio, and then look at the C7 by itself and decide to play C Mixolydian or C whole tone or a C arpeggio, C7 arpeggio, sorry. So in this way, you're outlining each of the tonalities implied by the polychord, thus creating some polytonality. Now, some notes will of course clash, but that's okay. This is polytonality. It's supposed to be a little bit dissonant. We are, after all, superimposing unrelated keys over the top of each other. Now, because polychords are just another way of writing out a particular chord, you don't often find them in written out lead sheets. Lead sheets generally just have a simplified version of the chord. So instead of writing an A flat 7 over C7 polychord, a lead sheet will often just write C7 sharp 9 flat 13, or just C7 altered, or maybe even just C7. Even if the original composer intended or played a polychord. Having said that, you will occasionally find polychords written out in transcriptions of more modern jazz musicians. For example, you'll find them in Windows by Chick Corea and Dolphin Dance by Herbie Hancock. Another thing to note is that if you play a polychord exactly as written, then you might end up with numerous doubled notes. Now, as a general rule, you want to try and avoid doubling notes. So for example, if you're playing an A flat major 7 over C7 polychord, you could emit the C and the G in the right hand in the A flat major 7 chord because you're already playing them in the C7 chord down here with your left hand. So you could just play C, E, G, B flat, A flat, E flat. Now you can also voice or play each chord in a polychord in any inversion and in any order. And they can also overlap. So for example, let's say we want to play a G flat major triad over a C major triad. So we could play them completely separated, an octave apart, the C major triad down here and the G flat major triad up here. Or we could make them overlap, so play a C major triad here and a G flat major triad here, so that the G flat chord starts before the C chord finishes. Or you could play different inversions of each chord, so playing the C major triad in the first inversion, and that kind of fills out this empty spot that was here when we were playing in root position, so it sounds a bit nicer. Or you could kind of break up the chord and play, say, a 10th, so like C, G, E, and then B flat, D flat, G flat. Right, so each of those is just a slightly different voicing of that G flat over C polychord. So you can play around with inversions and the orders of the notes, but you still want to generally keep the notes of each chord relatively close together so that the polychord is still played as two separate chords. And so avoid breaking up each individual chord too much. So for example, playing C, G flat, D flat, E, G, B flat, that really breaks up the G flat major and C major triads, so you kind of lose that little bit of that polychord feel. Right, it's just an interesting voicing of a C7 flat 9 sharp 11 chord now, and it's not really a polychord. It's still a fine chord to use and a fine voicing. You can still use it. It's just arguably not really a polychord anymore because we really broke up those two chords and they're not really played as clumps together anymore. So far, all the above examples have been polychords that only make use of available tensions. But in more contemporary or modern jazz, you'll also find polychords which make use of unavailable tensions and are therefore non-standard chords. This is especially the case with more atonal songs. So you could find polychords like D flat major over C major, so the F here, the natural 11, is an unavailable tension, or an A flat minor over C7, so the B conflicts with the B flat and the E flat conflicts with the E, or a B flat minor triad over a C major triad, so the B flat conflicts with the B and we have this F here, which is again an unavailable tension, or a B major triad over a C major triad, so that the E and the E flat conflict. Right, so these polychords do not obviously describe any kind of standard tonal chord. Now, I'll create a separate video on modern jazz harmony, but for the purposes of this video, all you really need to know is that the same rules apply here. You can play a scale comprised of all the notes in the chord. So over an A flat minor on C7 polychord, you could play a scale that has the notes C, E flat, E, F sharp, G, A flat, B flat, B. Now sometimes it may be a real scale, and sometimes you might just have to create a new scale to fit over this particular polychord by just taking all the notes in the polychord and arranging them in order in an octave, and then that's your scale. Now the term poly in polychord implies many, so not just two. So it's possible to have more than two chords in a polychord. For example, you could have a G on A flat on D polychord. So G on A flat on D. Right, that's a really dense and pretty full-on polychord, three-tiered polychord or three-chord polychord, but it technically is still a polychord. Right? Polychords, many chords superimposed. You could even find a polychord within a slash chord, right? Who knows? Once you hit modern, contemporary, atonal jazz, anything is possible. But again, they all work just the same way as I've described above. Either you analyze the individual notes separately and try to create some kind of single regular chord, or play the implied scale for each individual chord. So when playing your next song, see if you can insert one or two polychords as a substitute for a regular chord. You can even use one of the more dissonant and interesting ones and just see what happens. Like playing a 2-5-1 in C, but substituting a B on C polychord in place of that C major 7. And just see how it sounds and how you like it.